Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Tactics Board. The big games keep on coming for Liam Manning, who faces his former employers, Bristol City, this weekend when they travel to Carrow Road to take on his Norwich City side. And it's fair to say that the feeling around the place is not a positive one, not only because of the form at home on the pitch, of course, 5 consecutive losses to start the season at Carrow Road, but also off the pitch. Fans are discontented after many of them will have to move out of the River End to accommodate a change for away supporters, more premium seating. I think a meeting at Carrow Road in the last few days really spelt out how angry some of those fans are. But if there's one thing Norwich can do at the moment to turn that around on the pitch, it's to get a victory against Bristol City. And it won't necessarily be an easy one. The Robins not in the best form, but certainly looking better than Liam Manning's side have over the last few games. Of course, a first opportunity to put things right after a first East Anglian derby loss in over 16 years as well. So I think the pressure's on for Norwich, but as Manning said in his pre-match press conference, the only way they can really turn it round is to focus on how to win games. And here on Tactics Board, I'm going to take a look at how they might do that. First of all, I'll take you through my predicted 11 for the game. Then we're going to look a little bit closer at Bristol City, the visitors, and how they set up, how that might work tactically against Norwich, and what the game might look like as a result. And then we're going to come on to Josh Sargent, who obviously hasn't scored in his last 5 games, having scored 6 goals in his first 5 games of the season. We're going to look at where that's going wrong, whether it's his fault, his teammates, the system, what that is, and how Norwich can solve it. But we're going to start with my predicted lineup. So without further ado, here's the team I think Manning will pick for tomorrow's game. So I've gone for Vladan Kovacevic in goal with Jack Stacey at right back, Lucia Mahovo at left back, Jakov Medic and Harry Darling in the centre of defence, with Pelle Matson and Kenny McLean in midfield, Jovan Makama on the right, Oscar Schwartau on the left, and Ante Cianats just behind Josh Sargent up front. Now, the major problem that Manning has to deal with going into this one tactically is Jose Cordoba, and the fact that he'll be missing with a hamstring injury at least until the next international break in November. Now, I know he's kind of a controversial player, somebody who a lot of people still don't have a very strong opinion of, and I can understand that based on some of his performances earlier on in the season, particularly out of position against Wrexham. He was obviously very poor, but I think in the last 2 games against West Brom and Ipswich, if there's one thing you can say Norwich have improved at, it's the proactivity out of possession. The press has been much higher and they've been able to create chances from that sense. At times they've looked stronger defensively through that as well, and I actually think Cordoba has been probably the main player in that, really, because he allows them to press high up the pitch, and his pace in behind means they can push high, and sometimes the defensive line is as high as on the halfway line, because they know that if a ball goes in behind and the opposition team try to explore that space, that Cordoba often has the pace and the strength to go and win that ball and to sort of lever opposition strikers off that. He did that really well a couple of times against George Hurst at Ipswich. So I think they have to find a way to combat that. Manning said at his pre-match press conference he would try to play in the same way and try to do the same things. But you look at some of the players that he has and you kind of wonder where that's coming from. Too early for Shane Duffy, this one, as he comes back from a calf injury. Although, to be honest, I don't think he really has the attributes to be able to play that style of football anyway. Then you've got Rory McConville, who I actually wrote a piece about in the week and said it might be his time to shine with Cordoba now out injured, but he hasn't played a championship game this season. His only appearance has been in that 3-0 loss to Southampton in the Carabao Cup, so it feels unlikely that he gets thrown in. I think even he would be a slight downgrade on the pace of Cordoba, even though he looks slightly more athletic than some of the other options. The one I think Manning will go with, and whether it's right or wrong, he clearly has a lot of faith in this player, is Jakov Medic. he obviously was in the team most of the time in that central defensive three, and then when it became a two, he remained in there. Certainly not the same pace as Cordoba, and actually he's been exposed a couple of times already this season when strikers have run in behind him. But Manning trusted him for much of the season. Perhaps he just puts him in there and hopes that Darling can provide that pace, because he's certainly quicker than Medic. I still don't think he's anywhere near the level of Cordoba in terms of providing that cover in behind. But as I said, Manning said he would retain the same style of play. So it's how he does that. And I'm not sure he really has the options, but he insisted he did. So that will certainly be an interesting tactical dilemma and an interesting tactical development in tomorrow's game. A couple of other decisions for Manning to make. I think across that front line, probably there has to be change, just because, I talked about the high press and how that's yielded chances, but still in possession, they don't have that consistent, reliable pathway to creating chances. And even against West Brom in sort of the last 20-30 minutes, which was probably their best spell this season in terms of chance creation, it was a lot of it just because West Brom were dropping deeper and deeper. Norwich were just whipping cross after cross in, and maybe even, they probably should have equalised, to be fair, but I don't think that's a sustainable way of creating chances going forward. I think their best player to do that is Mate Jurasek, but as I've spoken about previously on Tactics Board, he just doesn't really have that intensity, that physicality, that urgency about his game to really contribute to the press. So if you aren't relying so much on a high press, and maybe they shouldn't be given the Cordoba injury, then I think Jurasek is a luxury that you can afford. But if that's going to be your main way to create chances, he, I think, provides quite an easy way to get out for opposition teams. So I'm not sure Manning will go with him. Obviously, we know he rates Ante Sienats very highly, even though he's had a really poor start to the season. Again, I thought the pressing against Ipswich from him was pretty good, but just in possession, he looks not even like the player he was last season, let alone the £8.5 million player Ben Napper thought he was getting when that's what he paid Rakov Shestakova. But clearly Manning still rates him and has included him in most of his team selections so far this season. He's only missed the one game, he even came on as a substitute against West Brom, but that was the only game he didn't start. And I feel like there probably will be a place in the team for him, especially in that number 10 position where obviously Miko Topic played against Ipswich, but certainly isn't that profile of player, and we'll come onto it later when we talk about Josh Sargent in terms of the effect that can have. But yeah, I think probably Manning will go for a slightly more attacking option in that number 10 position, and I can see it being Sienats based on who he's chosen so far. And then the other change is Makama, who, I think has been pretty good for Norwich so far this season. Maybe doesn't have that nuance to his game that sometimes you want, but compared to some of the other players who Manning has tried in that position, I think has given a lot more, has obviously scored a couple of goals and looks like a prospect who gives them something different. So I don't think there would be any harm in starting him in this one, and I think there's a good chance that Manning will. On to Bristol City, and ironically, Gerhard Struber, their new head coach, has kept a lot of the elements that Liam Manning brought to Ashton Gate and his tactical system. The 3-4-3 that they're still going with actually looks a lot more like Manning's Bristol City than Norwich City do at the moment. Obviously, they've retained a lot of those same players, and certainly there was nowhere near the same churn in terms of transfers and the different players that they went for in the summer. So Struber's kept a lot of it. A lot of it has been the high press, which I spoke about Manning kind of starting to implement at Norwich, but certainly when Bristol City were at their best last season when they were qualifying for the playoffs, the press was a really important part of it. And I think when you look at Struber's career so far, it was clear that he was going to bring that to Bristol City, and he's maybe gone even more aggressive with it. But he has largely retained the same principles. I think where it's changed mostly has been in possession. Now, we know Manning likes the variety. He talks about football as a kind of cat and mouse game and giving the players the opportunity to choose things. But Struber has been a little bit more consistent in terms of what he wants from his players. He wants it to be direct, and although he wants it to be accurate rather than just lumping balls forward, he wants to be excited by the football almost all the time. And that's obviously very high octane. It can often lead in teams to them tailing off as the season goes on, but it's been quite effective for Bristol City so far in terms of the underlying numbers and the XG that they've produced. They are one of the top teams in the division so far this season. They've got a lot of attacking talent in there. Anis Mehmeti, of course, someone who was part of the Norwich Academy for a couple of years and then released, but has really come into his own at Bristol City. And they do form that attacking three that obviously Manning was trying to institute at Norwich, with those kind of two wide number 10s that just didn't really work at all with the squad that Norwich have. But at Bristol City, it works perfectly. And that's where maybe I would worry for Norwich a little bit, particularly if they don't have much pace in their back line. Because if they go with a two and their fullbacks push on, which you'd suggest Lucian Mahovo and Jack Stacey will do if it does end up being those two, then you could easily end up in a situation where it's 3v2. You've got a lot of pace in that front line, particularly from Mehmeti, running against Medic and Darling most likely, but either way it will probably be much more pacey than the defensive duo that Norwich have. And if they leave themselves outnumbered at any point in that situation, Bristol City go direct. Unless Darling and Medic win the first ball, which is obviously their best opportunity, probably where they're strongest, and they are both quite good aerially, which will probably help them in this game. But if Bristol City can find a way beyond them and in behind them, I can't see any way of them catching up. So probably a big sweeping role for Vladan Kovacevic in goal, but also Norwich need to be very careful with when they push the fullbacks forward so that they're not left outnumbered by that sort of front three that Bristol City used under Manning and then have continued to use under Struber. Either way, it's a very interesting team that they have, and a lot of the hallmarks of Manning's football, even if they have changed things ever so slightly since their new man came in. So Josh Sargent then, and a debate that probably hasn't been front and centre for understandable reasons this international break with all that's been going on. But I think quite a concern for Norwich. As I said earlier, he scored 6 goals in his first 5 games of the season, and then he's gone 5 without scoring any goals. And of course, you look at his quality, the kind of goals he was producing earlier on in the season, and you would never say that that was entirely his fault. But I do think some of the elements are signs that he's kind of dropped off a little bit. I think his pressing has been slightly less energetic, and you might just say, to be fair, that that's because he's been playing almost every minute for Norwich. He's so important for them, and we know, he often gets to this part of the season and his body kind of breaks down and he gets a long-term injury. So I think in that sense, although he would have liked to go away with the USA, I'm sure, and there is that World Cup, in the distance that he'll be thinking about, I think probably the break comes at a good time for him, and Manning kind of suggested the same thing at his press conference. So I think that might help with kind of the pressing side of things. The other thing is the shots and the numbers on his shots and how many he's getting on target. He's getting more on target than he was when he was scoring those goals, but obviously hasn't found the net in a long time. So it feels like maybe he's lost a little bit of confidence and he's playing it a little bit safe in that sense. But I also think some of it is the fact that he's shooting from further distance. It feels like with this pressing setup, a lot of the time he's receiving the ball on the edge of the box and he kind of has to do things by himself from there. And it's great getting to the edge of the box and having a 2v3 in a situation that you don't get often in the Championship, but you can't really win games by only creating those sorts of chances. And that's why Norwich can't really rely just on pressing in their current setup. You saw Mirko Topic in that number 10 position, as I referenced earlier, against Ipswich, and he actually was really helpful for the pressing. Obviously, as a defensive midfielder, his reading of the game, his sort of closing of spaces and tackling is really good. But then the problem is you have a career defensive midfielder in a number 10 position trying to set up Sargent. And if it's not him, it's Ante Cianats, who obviously has been in pretty poor form and some of his passes and shots aren't really coming off. And they don't really have that number 10 player. So unless Oscar Schwartau or Jovan Makama or whoever they have in those wide positions can get a little bit higher and can win the ball as often as the number 10 and Sargent, you wonder where those chances are sort of being, not that the chances aren't being created in the first place, but they're being advanced from, a position where you might score 1 in 10 times to 5 in 10 times. And interestingly enough, that was actually a principle Johannes Torp talked a lot about during his reign, about converting small chances into big chances and not just getting off as many shots as you possibly can. So I think that's where Norwich need to show a bit more quality and maybe get better players and more creative players into good positions in that sense. And I think that would help Sargent a lot as well. But in terms of on the ball and off the ball, I still think his levels have dropped slightly, probably still less than, the large majority of his teammates. So I'm not necessarily singling him out for criticism. It's just that obviously Norwich lean on him so much that they really do need him to produce, and I think it's worth looking at the reasons why. So I'm interested to see if he can produce against Bristol City and if Norwich can produce on the whole, really. It feels like with everything going on at the moment, they really, really need a win. Of course, we'll have coverage of the game across our channels, so go to pinkun.com/subscribe if you haven't already, and you'll have access to all of our content. Thank you very much for joining me on Tactics Board, and I'll see you for the next one.